the city of the heavens. Summer was at its hottest when Horam returned from the land of Cush. The swallows had long vanished into the river mud, the pools about the city stagnated while locusts and flea beetles attacked the crops. But in Thebes the gardens of the wealthy were green and cool and luxuriant, and on either side of the avenue of ram's flowers bloomed in all the colors of the rainbow. Only the poor lacked water, and their food alone was polluted by the dust that fell everywhere like a net, filming the leaves of the acacias and sycamores in their quarter of the city. Southward, on the farther shore, Pharaoh's golden house with its walls and gardens rose through the heat haze with the blue, misty glow of a dream. Although the hottest season was now upon us, Pharaoh had not left for his summer palaces in the lower kingdom but remained in Thebes. From this everyone knew that something was about to happen. As the heavens darkened before a sandstorm, so the hearts of the people were overshadowed with dread. No one was surprised to see warriors marching into Thebes at dawn on all the southern roads. With dusty shields, gleaming copper spearheads, and strung bows the black troops marched along the streets and stared about them in wonder, the whites of their eyes flashing in their sweaty faces. They followed their barbarous standards into the empty barracks, where cooking fires soon began to blaze and stones were heated to put in the great earthenware cauldrons. Meanwhile, ships of the fleet were berthing alongside the quays, and the chariots and plumed horses of the officers were put ashore from the transports. There were no Egyptians to be seen among these troops, who were for the most part Nubians from the south and Shardanas from the desert in the northwest. They occupied the city, watchfires were kindled at the street corners, and the river was closed. Gradually in the course of the day labor ceased in workshop and mill, in office and warehouse. The merchants carried in their goods from the street and barred their shutters, and the keepers of taverns and pleasure houses hurried to hire sturdy fellows with cudgels to protect their premises. The people arrayed themselves in white and began to stream from all quarters of the city toward the great temple of Ammon, until its courts were crammed and many were gathered outside the walls. Meanwhile the word flew round that during the night the temple of Aten had been defiled and desecrated. The rotting carcass of a dog had been thrown on the altar, and the watchman had been found with his throat slit from ear to ear. When the people heard this they shot sidelong glances of fear, but many could not refrain from secret jubilation. "Cleanse your instruments, Lord," said Captor gravely. "I believe that before nightfall there will be much work for you to do. If I do not mistake, you will be opening skulls also." Yet nothing noteworthy took place before the evening. A few drunken Nubians plundered shops and raped a couple of women. The guards seized them, and they were flogged in the sight of the people, which brought little consolation either to the merchants or to the women. Hearing that Horam was aboard the commander's ship, I went to the harbor, though with little hope of speech with him. The guard heard me with indifference and went to announce my arrival, then to my surprise returned to summon me to the captain's cabin. Thus for the first time I boarded a warship and looked about me with great curiosity, yet only the armament and the more numerous crew distinguished it from other vessels, since merchantmen also had gilded bows and colored sails. So once more I encountered Horam. He seemed to me even taller and of greater dignity than before. His shoulders were broad, and the muscles of his arms powerful. But there were lines in his face, and his eyes were bloodshot and weary. I bowed low before him and stretched forth my hands at knee level. He exclaimed with a bitter laugh, "See, it is Sinew, the son of the wild ass. In truth you come at an auspicious hour." He did not embrace me because of his dignity, but turned to a fat, pop-eyed little officer who stood beside him panting in the heat. Horam handed him his golden whip of office saying, "Here it is, then, take charge." Removing his gold-embroidered collar, he set it about Potbelly's neck and added, "Assume command, and may the blood of the people flow over your filthy hands." Then he turned abruptly to me. "Sinew, my friend, I am free to go with you wherever you will, and I hope you have a mat in your house where I can stretch my bones, for by Set and all devils I am mortally weary of arguing with maniacs." He then laid his hands on the shoulders of the little officer, who was a head shorter than himself, and said, "Look well upon him, friend Sinew, and impress what you see upon your memory, for here is a man in whose hands lies the destiny of Thebes this day." Pharaoh put him in my place when I told Pharaoh he was mad. And having seen him, you may readily surmise that Pharaoh will soon have need of me again. He laughed and smote his knees, but there was no mirth in his laughter. It frightened me. The little officer looked at him meekly, his eyes popping with the heat and the sweat running down his face and neck and between his fat breasts. "Be not angry with me, Horam," he said in a high voice. "You know that I have not coveted your whip of office. I prefer my cats and the peace of my garden to the din of war. But who am I to set myself against the commands of Pharaoh? And he declares that there will be no war, but that the false god shall fall without bloodshed." "He declares the thing he hopes for," answered Horam. "His heart runs ahead of his reason as a bird outstrips a snail, so that his words have no weight. You should think for yourself and shed blood moderately, with due consideration, even though it may be the blood of Egyptians. By my falcon, I will flog you with my own hand if you have left your good sense in the cages with your pedigreed cats, for in the time of the late Pharaoh you were an eminent warrior, I hear, which is doubtless why Pharaoh has entrusted you with this tedious task." He thumped the new commander on the back so that the little fellow gulped and gasped, and the words he had meant to say stuck fast in his throat. Horam sprang up on deck in 2 strides, and the soldiers straightened themselves and greeted him with raised spears. He waved his hand at them, crying, "Farewell, scum! Obey this little pedigreed pussy, who now bears the whip of command. Obey him as if he were a child, and see to it that he does not tumble off his chariot or hurt himself with his own knife." The soldiers laughed and shouted his praise, but he grew wroth and shook his fist at them, saying, "I shall not bid you farewell. We shall meet again in a little while, for I can see your purpose in your eyes. I say to you, behave yourselves and remember my words, or I shall have the hide of your backs in ribbons when I come again." He asked where I lived and told the officer of the watch, but he forbade him to send his baggage to my house, believing it to be safer aboard the warship. Then, as in the old days, he laid his arm about my neck and sighed, "Truly, Sinew, if anyone has earned an honest carouse tonight, it is I." I told him of the crocodile's tail, and he appeared so much interested that I ventured to beg for a special guard to be posted at Kaptara's tavern. He gave the necessary orders to the officer of the watch, who promised to pick out some reliable older men for the purpose. In this way I was able to do Kaptara a service that cost me nothing. I was by then aware that the crocodile's tail contained a number of small private rooms where grave robbers and receivers of stolen goods were wont to settle their accounts, and where at times distinguished ladies kept appointments with muscular porters from the harbor. I took Horam to such a room. Merritt brought him a crocodile's tail in a shell. He swallowed it at one draught, coughed somewhat and said, "Oh, oh." He asked for another, and when Merritt had gone to fetch it, he remarked that she was a beautiful woman and asked what there was between us. I assured him that there was nothing. Nevertheless, I was glad that Merritt had not yet acquired her new open-fronted dress. But Horam made no advances. He offered her respectful thanks, and taking the cup upon the flat of his hand, he tasted it warily. With a deep sigh he said, "Sinew, tomorrow blood will flow through the streets of Thebes, and I can do nothing to prevent it. Pharaoh is my friend, and I love him despite his madness. I once covered him with my shoulder cloth, and it was then that my falcon bound our destinies together. Perhaps I love him because of his madness, but I will not be involved in this struggle, for I have my own future to think of and would not have the people hate me. O Sinew, my friend! Much water has flowed down the Nile since the day of our last meeting in that stinking Syria. I have just come from the land of Cush, where by Pharaoh's command I have disbanded the garrisons and brought the Negro troops back to Thebes, so that in the south the country is undefended. If this goes on, it can be but a question of time before disturbances break out in Syria. Revolt may bring Pharaoh to his senses, but meanwhile the country is impoverished. Ever since his coronation, the mines have been worked by very few and without profit. Disciplining the lazy with sticks is no longer permitted. Instead, they are put on short rations. Truly, my heart trembles for Pharaoh's sake, and Egypt's, and for the sake of his God, though of gods, being a warrior, I know nothing. I say only that many, a very great many, will perish on account of that God. It is madness, for surely the gods exist to keep the people quiet and not to sow unrest among them. After a pause he went on, tomorrow Ammon is to be deposed, and I for one shall not regret him, for he has grown too powerful to share Egypt with Pharaoh. It is statesmanlike of Pharaoh to overthrow him, for then he can confiscate his vast possessions, which may yet prove our salvation. The priests of other gods have been overshadowed by Ammon and are envious, but neither do they love Aten, and it is the priests who rule the people's hearts. For this reason disaster must follow. But, said I, Ammon is a hateful god, and his priests have kept the people in darkness for too long and stifled every living thought, until no one dares say a word without Ammon's leave. Whereas Aten offers light and a life of freedom, a life without fear, and that is a great thing, a very great thing, my friend Horam. I do not know what you mean by fear, he said. The people must be controlled by fear. If the gods govern them, the throne needs no weapons to support it. Were Ammon content to be Pharaoh's servant, he would fully deserve his place, for no nation can be ruled without fear. That is why Aten, with his gentleness and his cross of love, is an exceedingly dangerous god. He is a greater god than you believe, I said quietly, hardly knowing why I said it. Perhaps he is in you, without your knowledge, and in me. If the people understood him, he could save them all from fear and darkness. But it is more likely that many must die on his account, as you say, for those things that are eternal can only be imposed upon the general run of men by force. Horam regarded me impatiently as one looks at a babbling infant. Then, inspired by the crocodile's tale, he regained his good humor and said, at least we are agreed that it is time to oust Ammon, and if it is to be done, it should be done suddenly, by night and in secret, and all over the country at the same time. The priests of the highest grade should be executed at once and the others sent to the mines and quarries. But Pharaoh in his foolishness desires to do all openly with the knowledge of the people and in the light of his God, for the sun's disk is his God, no new doctrine, by the way. The thing is lunacy and will cost much blood. I would not agree to its execution since I had not been told of his plans beforehand. By Set and all devils, if I had known of the matter, I should have planned it well and overthrown Ammon so swiftly that he himself could hardly have grasped what had happened. But now every street boy in Thebes knows of the plan, the priests are rousing the people in the temple courtyards, men are breaking branches in their gardens to serve as weapons, and women go to the temple with washing clubs hidden beneath their clothes. By my falcon, I could weep at Pharaoh's madness. He bowed his head in his hands and shed tears over the trials that were to beset Thebes. Merit brought him the third crocodile's tail and gazed so admiringly upon his broad back and swelling muscles that I sharply bade her be gone and leave us alone. I tried to tell Horam of what I had seen in Babylon, in the land of Hatti and in Crete, until I saw that the crocodile had already clouted him on the head with its tail and he was slumbering heavily with his head in his hands. He lay that night in my arms, and I held vigil over his sleeping, hearing all night the reveling of soldiers in the tavern. Captor and the landlord felt bound to entertain them, that they might the more readily protect the house when disturbances began. But I did not enjoy myself, for I reflected that in every house in Thebes knives were being whetted, stakes sharpened, and pestles bound with copper. I think there were few in the city who slept that night. Certainly Pharaoh was not among them, but Horam, a warrior born, slept soundly. All night long the crowds watched before the temple. The poor lay on the cool lawns of the flower gardens while the priests made continual and lavish sacrifice to Ammon and dispensed sacrificial meat, bread, and wine to the people. They called on Ammon in a loud voice and promised eternal life to all who believed in him and gave their lives for his sake. The priests might have prevented bloodshed if they had so wished. They had but to submit, and Pharaoh would have left them in peace and not persecuted them, since his God abominated persecution and hatred. But power and wealth had gone to their heads, so that not even death deterred them. They knew that neither the people nor Ammon's few guards could oppose an armed force trained and toughened in war, but that such an army would sweep all aside as rising waters sweep aside dry straw. They desired bloodshed between Ammon and Aten, so as to make a murderer and criminal of Pharaoh, who would then be allowing dirty Negroes to shed the pure blood of Egypt. They desired sacrifice to be made to Ammon, that he might endure to all eternity, even were his image to be overthrown and his temple closed. After this long night the disk of Aten rose at last above the 3 eastern hills, and cool darkness gave place to the scorching heat of the day. In every street and public place horns were blown, and herald and read aloud a proclamation in which Pharaoh affirmed that Ammon was a false god and had now been deposed, that he was accursed to all eternity, that his name should be erased from all inscriptions and monuments and also from the tombs. All the temples of Ammon, both in the upper and lower kingdoms, all his land, cattle, slaves, buildings, gold, silver, and copper were forfeit to Pharaoh and his god. Pharaoh promised to transform the temples into open walks, and the gardens into public parks, and the sacred lakes into public lakes where the poor might bathe and draw water freely. He promised to divide the land of Ammon among those who own no land, that they might cultivate it in Aten's name. The people listened to this proclamation in silence, as custom required. Then everywhere in the streets and squares and before the temples, there arose a thunderous roar of Ammon. Ammon. So tremendous was the shout that the very stones and walls seemed to give it utterance. And now the black troops faltered. Their faces turned grey beneath the red and white paint, their eyes rolled white in their heads, and as they looked about them they saw that despite their numbers they were but a few in this mighty city they were seeing for the first time. Because of the great noise there were not many who heard that Pharaoh, to dissociate his name from that of Ammon, that day assumed the name of Akhenaten, the favored of Aten. The shout woke even Horam, who stretched himself and murmured smilingly, with his eyes still shut, "It is you, Bakit, the beloved of Ammon, my princess. Did you call me?" But when I nudged him in the side, he opened his eyes, and the smile fell from his face like an old garment. He felt his head and said, "By Set and all devils, yours was a potent drink, sinew. I was dreaming, I think." I said to him, "The people are calling on Ammon." Then he remembered everything and was in haste to go. We went through the wine shop, where we stumbled over the bare legs of girls and soldiers. Horam snatched a loaf from the shelf and emptied a jug of beer, and together we hastened to the temple through streets deserted as never before. On the way he washed at a fountain, plunging his head into the water with much puffing and blowing, for the crocodile's tail still pounded in his head. The plump little cat, whose name was Pepitamen, was disposing his troops and chariots before the temple. When he received word that all was ready and that every man understood his orders, he rose up in his gilded chair and cried out in a shrill voice, "Soldiers of Egypt! Bold men of Cush! Valiant Shardanas! Go now and overturn the image of Ammon the accursed, according to Pharaoh's command, and great shall be your reward." Having said this, he felt that he had done all that was required of him, and he sat himself down again contentedly on the soft cushions of his chair and let his slaves fan him, for it was already exceedingly hot. But before the temple stood a countless throng of white-clad people, men and women, old folk and children, and they did not yield before the advancing troops and chariots. With a great shout they cast themselves down so that the horses trampled on them and the wheels rolled over their bodies. The officers saw that they could not advance without bloodshed and called on their men to retire until they had received further orders, for Pharaoh had forbidden the shedding of blood. But blood already was flowing over the stones of the square, where the injured groaned and shrieked, and there was great excitement among the people when they saw the soldiers draw back. They believed the victory was theirs. Meanwhile, Pepitamen remembered that in his proclamation Pharaoh had changed his name to Akhenaten and suddenly resolved to change his also, to find favor with Pharaoh. When the officers came to take counsel with him, sweating and perplexed, he affected not to hear them, but opened his eyes wide and said, I know of no Pepitamen. My name is Pepitaten, Pepi the blessed of Aten. The officers, each of whom carried a gold-braided whip and commanded 1,000 men, were exceedingly irritated, and the commander of the chariots exclaimed, to the bottomless pit with Aten, What is this foolery? Give us your orders. Then Pepitaten mocked them, saying, Are you warriors or women? Disperse the people but shed no blood, for that Pharaoh has expressly forbidden. When the officers heard this they looked at one another and spat on the ground. Then, since there was nothing more they could do, they returned to our men. While these high councils were in progress, the people pressed forward on the retreating Negroes, wrenching up stones from the street and hurling them, swinging their pestles and broken boughs and shouting. The crowd was very great, and men exhorted one another with yells. Many Negroes felled by stones lay on the ground in their own blood. The horses went wild with the outcry of the people and reared and shied so that the charioteers had much ado to hold them. When the commander of the chariots returned to his troop, he found that the best and most costly animal of all had had an eye knocked out and was lame in one leg, having been struck by a stone. This made the man so savage that he began to howl with rage and cried, My arrow of gold, my roebuck, my sunbeam. They have put out your eye and broken your leg, but in truth you are dearer to my heart than all these people and the gods put together. Therefore I will be revenged, but let us not shed blood, for that Pharaoh has expressly forbidden. At the head of his chariots he tore into the mob, and every charioteer snatched up the noisiest of the rebels into his chariot, while the horses trampled the aged and the children, and the shouts were turned to groaning. But those whom the soldiers caught up they strangled in the reins so that no blood flowed. Then they wheeled and drove back with the corpses trailing behind them to strike terror into the hearts of the people. The Nubians unstrung their bows, charged in, and strangled their victims with the bowstrings. They also strangled children, and defended themselves against stones and blows with their shields. But every painted Negro who became separated from his fellows was trampled underfoot by the rabble and torn to pieces. They succeeded in dragging down the driver from one chariot, and they smashed his head against the paving stones amid howls of frenzy. The royal commander-in-chief Pepitaten grew uneasy as time passed, and the water clock beside him gurgled away, and the roar of the people met his ear like the rushing of a torrent. He summoned his officers and rebuked them for the delay, and he said, My Sudanese cat Mimo is to kitten today. I am anxious about her because I am not there to help her. In the name of Aten go in and overturn that accursed statue that we may all go home, or by Set and all devils I will snatch the chains from your necks and break your whips, I swear it. When the officers heard this, they knew that they were betrayed, whatever the outcome, and they resolved at least to save their honor as soldiers. They reformed their men and charged, hurling the people aside like chaff before a flood. The spears of the Negroes were reddened, blood flowed over the square, and 100 times 100 men, women, and children perished that morning in the name of Aten. For when the priests saw that the soldiers were attacking in earnest, they closed the pylon gates, and the people fled this way and that like stampeded sheep. Negroes drunk with blood pursued them and slew them with arrows, while the charioteers stormed through the streets transfixing every fugitive with their spears. But in their flight the people forced their way into the temple of Aten, overturned the altars, and slew such priests as they caught, and the pursuing chariots thundered in after them. Thus the stone pavement of Aten's temple was soon running with blood and strewn with the dying. But the walls of Ammon's temple blocked the way for Pepitaten's black troops, who were not accustomed to storming such defenses, nor did their battering rams avail to force the copper gates. The soldiers could do no more than encircle the temple, and from the walls the priests yelled imprecations upon them, and the temple guards let fly at them with their arrows and hurled their spears, so that many a painted Negro fell, and to no purpose. From the open place before the temple rose the thick reek of blood, and flies from all over the city gathered there in the billowing dust. Pepitatan came in his golden chair and turned grey in the face at the hideous stench. He bade slaves burn incense about him, and he wept and rent his clothes at the sight of the countless dead. Yet his heart was full of uneasiness on account of Mimo the Sudanese cat, so he said to his officers, "I fear that Pharaoh's wrath will be most terrible, for you have not overturned the image of Ammon, but instead the blood flows in streams along the gutters. I must hasten to Pharaoh to report on what has passed, and I shall try to speak on your behalf. At the same time I shall be able to call at my house, to see my cat, and change my clothes, for the smell here is fearful and soaks into the very skin. We cannot storm the temple walls today. Pharaoh himself must decide what is to be done now." Nothing further occurred that day. The officers withdrew their men from the walls and from among the dead, and they caused the supply wagons to be driven up that the Nubians might eat. During the nights that followed, fires raged in the city, houses were rifled, painted Negroes drank wine from golden cups, and Shardanas lay in soft, canopied beds. All the dregs of the city slunk forth, thieves, tomb robbers, and footpads who had no fear of the gods, not even of Ammon. Piously they blessed the name of Aten and entered his temple, which had been hastily cleansed, receiving the cross of life at the hands of such priests as survived. They hung this about their necks as a protecting talisman which would enable them to steal, murder, and pillage at their ease under cover of night. Many years were to pass before Thebes reverted to what it had once been, for during these days power and wealth drained away from it like blood from a plethoric body. Horam stayed at my house, sleepless and haggard. His eyes grew more somber every day, and he had no stomach for the food Muti repeatedly set before him. Muti, like many other women, was greatly taken with Horam and had more respect for him than for myself, who, learning or no learning, was nothing but a flabby-muscled man. Horam said, "What do I care for either Ammon or Aten? But they have let my men run wild so that many backs must come under my lash and heads must fall before I can bring them to their senses. And this is a great pity, for they are good fighting men when disciplined." Captor grew richer every day, and his face shone with grease. He now spent his nights at the Crocodile's Tail, for the officers and sergeants of the Shardanas paid for their drams with gold, and in the back rooms of the tavern lay ever-growing heaps of stolen treasure, jewels and coffers and mats, which the customers gave in exchange for wine without asking about the price. No one attacked the house, and thieves walked wide of it, for it was guarded by Horam's men. By the third day my stock of medicines was exhausted, and it was impossible to buy more, even for gold. My arts were vain in the face of the disease that spread through the poor quarter from the corpses and foul water. I was tired, and my heart was like a wound in my breast, and my eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. I was sickened with everything, with the poor, with wounds, with Aten, and I went to the Crocodile's Tail where I drank mixed wine until I fell asleep. In the morning Merit roused me. I was lying on her mat with her beside me. Deeply ashamed I said to her, "Life is like a cold night, but truly it is sweet when two lonely mortals keep one another warm, though their hands and eyes tell lies for the sake of their friendship." She yawned sleepily. "How do you know that my hands and eyes are lying? I am weary of smiting soldiers over the fingers and kicking their shins. Here by your side, Sinew, is the only safe place in the city, a place where no one will lay a hand on me. Why this should be I cannot tell, and I am a little offended, for I am said to be beautiful, nor is there anything amiss with my belly, though you have not deigned to look at it." I drank the beer she offered me, to clear my aching head, and found nothing to say. She looked into my eyes with a smile, though in the depths of her brown one sorrow lay still, like the dark waters at the bottom of a well. She said, "Sinew, I would help you if I could, and I know that in this city there is a woman who owes you an immeasurable debt. In these days roofs are floors, and doors open outward, and payment for many old debts is demanded in the streets. Perhaps it would do you good also to go a-dunning, and so lose the belief that every woman is a wilderness. I said that I had never believed this of her, but I went and her words remained with me, for I was but human. My heart was swollen with the sight of carnage, and I had tasted the frenzy of hatred so that I was afraid for myself. I remembered the temple of the cat and the house beside it, though time had drifted like sand over these memories. But during the days of terror the dead rose from their graves, and I remembered my father Senmut in his tenderness and my good mother Keeper. There was a taste of blood in my mouth as I thought of them. At this time no one in Thebes was too rich or too eminent to be in danger when he walked abroad, and I need only have hired a few soldiers to carry out my purpose. But as yet I did not know what my purpose was. On the 5th day there was an uneasiness even among the officers under Pepitaton's command, for the soldiers ceased to obey the notes of the horn and insulted their leaders in the streets, snatching the golden whips from them and snapping them across their knees. The officers went to Pepitaton, who was growing weary of a warrior's life and missed his cats, and they persuaded him to seek audience of Pharaoh, tell him the truth, and relinquish his collar of office. And so on the 5th day Pharaoh's messengers came to my house to summon Horam before Pharaoh. Horam rose like a lion from his couch, washed and dressed, and went back with the men, growling to himself at the thought of all he would say to Pharaoh. Now even Pharaoh's authority was tottering, and no one knew what tomorrow might bring. When he stood before him, he said, "Akhenaton, there is not a moment to be lost, and I have no time to remind you of all I counseled you to do. If you desire all to be as it was, give me your authority for 3 days, and on the 3rd day I will restore it to you. You need never know of what has passed." Pharaoh said to him, "Will you overthrow Ammon?" Horam answered, "Truly you are a man possessed. Yet after what has happened Ammon must fall if Pharaoh's majesty is to survive. Therefore, I will overthrow him, but do not ask how it will be done." Pharaoh said, "You shall not harm his priests, for they know not what they do." Horam answered him and said, "In truth your skull should be opened, for it is plain that nothing else will cure you. Nevertheless I will obey your command for the sake of that hour when I covered your weakness with my shoulder cloth." Then Pharaoh wept and handed him his whip and his crook for 3 days. How this matter came about I know only from what Horam told me, and after the manner of warriors he was given to fanciful embellishment. Be that as it may, he returned to the city in Pharaoh's gilded carriage and drove through street after street calling the soldiers by name. He took the trustiest among them with him and caused horns to be sounded, mustering the men under their standards, their falcons and lions' tails. The search went on all night. Yells and howls were heard from the men's sleeping quarters, and canes by the score were worn to shreds in the hands of the castigators, whose arms grew weary and who groaned that never before had they known such toil. Horam sent his best men on patrol through the streets to grab every man who did not obey the horns and lead him to be flogged. Many whose hands and garments were bloody had their heads cut off in the sight of their fellows. When morning dawned, the riffraff of Thebes had scuttled back to their holes like rats, for everyone caught thieving or housebreaking was speared on the spot. Horam also summoned together all the builders in the city and bade them tear down the houses of the wealthy and break up ships for their timber, and he set Laborus to building battering rams and siege towers, so that the noise of hammering filled the night. But above all other noises rose the yells of Nubians and Shardanas under the lash, an agreeable sound to the citizens of Thebes. Horam wasted no time in vain negotiation with the priests, but as soon as it grew light he gave his officers their orders. Siege towers were placed at 5 points about the temple walls, while at the same time battering rams began to thunder against the gates. No one was wounded, for the soldiers made roofs of their shields. The priests and temple guards could make no stand against so determined and well-concerted an attack. They dispersed their forces and ran hither and thither in panic about the walls, while from the courts below came the cries of terrified people who were sheltering there. When the chief priests saw that the gates were giving way and that Negroes were gaining the walls, they caused horns to be sounded for a truce that the lives of the people might be saved. They were of the opinion that Ammon had had sacrifice enough, and they desired to spare the remainder of the faithful for service in the future. The gates were therefore opened and the soldiers allowed the packed masses to escape as Horam had commanded. The people fled, calling upon Ammon, and were content to hasten home, for the uproar had abated and they were weary indeed of standing so long in the courtyards beneath the burning sun. Thus Horam took possession of the forecourts, stores, stables, and workshops of the temple without severe casualties. The houses of life and death also were brought under his control, and he sent physicians from the house of life into the city to heal the sick, but he did not meddle with the house of death, for those who dwell there are apart and in sanctuary whatever may befall in the outside world. The priests and guards made a last stand in the great temple to protect the Holy of Holies. The priests laid spells on the guards and drugged them that they might fight to the death without feeling pain. The battle in the great temple went on until nightfall, but by then the bewitched guards had all been slain with such priests as had made armed resistance, and there remained only the priests of the highest grade who had gathered about their god in the sanctuary. Horam gave order for the fighting to cease and at once sent men to gather up the dead and throw them into the river. Then, approaching the priests of Ammon, he said, "I wage no war against Ammon, for I serve Horus, my falcon. Nevertheless I must obey the command of Pharaoh and depose your god. Would it not be more agreeable for both yourselves and me if no image were found in the Holy of Holies for the soldiers to desecrate? For I do not wish to commit sacrilege, though because of my oath I must serve Pharaoh. Reflect upon my words, to that end I will allow you a water measure's time. Thereafter you may depart in peace, and none shall raise his hand against you since I do not seek your lives." These words were agreeable to the priests, who had braced themselves to die for the sake of Ammon. They remained in the sanctuary until a measure of water had run from the water clock. Then Horam with his own hand tore down the veil of the sanctuary and let the priests depart. When they had gone, the sanctuary was empty and no image of Ammon was to be seen. The priests had made haste to demolish it, and they bore away the pieces under their cloaks, that later they might proclaim a miracle and affirm that Ammon still lived. Horam caused seals to be set on all stores, and he sealed the cellars where the gold and silver was hidden with his own hand. That evening, by the light of torches, stone masons set to work to efface the name of Ammon from every statue and inscription. During the night Horam had the square cleared of bodies and fragments of bodies and sent men to quench the fires that still raged in some parts of the city. When the wealthier and more aristocratic the bands learned that Ammon had been deposed and that peace and good order had been restored, they arrayed themselves in their finest clothes, lit lamps before their houses, and went out into the streets to celebrate Aten's victory. Members of the court, who had taken refuge in Pharaoh's golden house, were now ferried back across the river to the city. Soon the sky over Thebes glowed red from the festival torches and lamps, and people strewed flowers in the streets and shouted and laughed and embraced one another. Horam could not prevent them plying the shardanas with wine nor hinder noble ladies from embracing Nubians who carried impaled upon the points of spears the shaven heads of the priests they had slain. Thebes rejoiced that night in the name of Aten. In the name of Aten all was permitted and there was no difference between Egyptian and Negro. In testimony of this the court ladies admitted Nubians to their houses, shook out their new summer dresses, and enjoyed the virility of the black men and the sour blood smell of their bodies. And when a wounded temple guard crawled out into the open from the shadow of the wall, calling on Ammon in his delirium, they smashed his head against the stones of the street, and the ladies danced in jubilation round the body. These things I saw with my own eyes, and having seen them, clutched my head in my hands, indifferent now to all that happened. I reflected that no god can cure man of his madness. I ran to the crocodile's tail, and with Merit's words blazing up in my heart, I called the soldiers who were on guard there. They obeyed me, having seen me in company with Horam, and I led them through that night of delirium, past revelers dancing in the streets, to the house of Nefer-Nefer-Nefer. There also torches and lamps were burning, and from the house, which had suffered no pillage, the noise of drunken revelry rang out into the street. When I had come thus far, my knees began to quake, and my stomach sank. I said to the soldiers, These are the orders of Horam, my friend, and the king's commander-in-chief. Go into the house where you will find a woman who carries her head haughtily and whose eyes are like green stones. Bring her here to me, and should she resist, smite her over the head with the butt of a spear, but do her no other harm." The soldiers strode in cheerfully. Soon the startled guests came reeling out, and servants called for the guards. My men soon returned with fruit and honey bread and jars of wine in their hands, and with them they carried Nefer-Nefer-Nefer. She had struggled, and they had struck her with a spear so that her smooth head was bloody and her wig had slipped off. I laid my hand on her breast, and her skin was smooth as warm glass, but to me it was as if I had laid my hand on a snakeskin. I felt her heart beating and knew that she was unharmed, yet I wrapped her in a dark cloth as corpses are wrapped and lifted her into a chair. The watch did not interfere when they saw that I had soldiers with me. These attended me to the gateway of the house of death, while I sat in the swaying chair with Nefer-Nefer-Nefer's senseless body in my arms. She was beautiful still, but more repulsive to me than a serpent. So we went on through the riotous night to the house of death, where I gave the soldiers gold and dismissed them, and I also sent away the chair. With Nefer-Nefer-Nefer in my arms I entered the house, and I said to the corpse washers who met me, "I bring you the body of a woman whom I found in the street. I do not know her name or her family, but I fancy the jewels she is wearing will reward you for your trouble if you will preserve her body forever." The men swore at me, saying, "Madman, do you think we have not had enough carrion to deal with in these days? And who will reward us for our trouble?" But when they had unwound the black cloth, they found that the body was yet warm, and when they took off the dress and the jewels, they saw that she was fair, fairer than any woman who had yet been brought to the house of death. They said no more to me, but laid their hands on her breast and felt her heart beating. They swiftly covered her once more in the black cloth, winking and grimacing at one another with delighted laughter. Then they said to me, "Go your way, stranger, and blessed be this act of yours. We shall do our best to preserve her body forever, and should it depend on us alone, we will keep her with us 70 times 70 days, that her body may be preserved indeed." Thus did I exact payment from Nefer-Nefer-Nefer for the debt in which she stood to me on my parents' account. I wondered how she would feel when she awoke in the recesses of the house of death, robbed of her wealth and in the power of corpse washers and embalmers. If I knew anything of them, they would never let her return to the light of day. This was my revenge, for it was through her that I ever came to know the house of death. But my revenge was childish, as I was later to discover. At the crocodile's tail I saw Merit and said to her, "I have enforced my demands, and in a more terrible manner than anyone has ever done. But my revenge gives me no relief, my heart is yet emptier than before, and despite the warmth of the night my limbs are cold." I drank wine, and it was as dust in my mouth. I said, "May my body perish if ever I lay my hand upon a woman again, for the more I think of woman the more do I fear her. Her body is a wilderness and her heart a mortal snare." She stroked my hands, and her brown eyes looked into mine as she said, "Sinew, you have never known a woman who wished you well." And I answered, "May all the gods of Egypt save me from a woman who wishes me well. Pharaoh also wishes only well, and the river is full of bobbing corpses because of his well-wishing." I drank wine, and I wept, saying, "Merit, your cheeks are smooth as glass and your hands are warm. Let me touch your cheeks with my lips this night and put my cold hands into your warm ones so that I may sleep without dreaming, and I will give you whatever you desire." She smiled sadly and said, "The crocodile's tail speaks through your mouth, but I am accustomed to that and I take no offense. Know therefore, Sinew, that I require nothing of you and never in my life have required anything of a man, from none have I taken a gift of any value. What I give from my heart, and to you also I give what you ask, for I am as lonely as you." She took the wine cup from my trembling hand, and having spread her mat for me, she lay down beside me, warming my hands in hers. I brushed her smooth cheeks with my lips and breathed in the fragrance of cedar from her skin, and I took pleasure with her. She was to me as my father and my mother, she was as a brazier on a winter's night and a beacon on the shore that guides the seaman home through a night of tempest. When I fell asleep, she was to me Minea whom I had lost forever, and I lay against her as if on the floor of the sea with Minea. I saw no evil dreams, but slept soundly, while she whispered in my ear such words as mothers whisper whose children fear the dark. From that night she was my friend, for in her arms I could believe once more that there was something greater than myself beyond my understanding, for which it was worthwhile to live. Next morning I said to her, Merit, I have broken a jar with a woman who is now dead, and I still have the silver ribbon with which I bound her long hair. Yet for the sake of our friendship, Merit, I am ready to break the jar with you if you wish it. Yawning, she held the back of her hand across her mouth and said, You must drink no more crocodiles' tails, Sinew, since they make you talk so foolishly next day. Remember that I grew up in a tavern and am no longer an innocent girl who might take you at your word, and be sorely disappointed. When I look into your eyes, Merit, I can believe that there are good women in the world, I said, and I brushed her smooth cheeks with my mouth. That was why I said it, that you might know how much you are to me. She smiled. You note that I forbade you to drink crocodiles' tails, for a woman first shows her fondness for a man by forbidding him something, to feel her own power. Let us not talk of jars, Sinew. You know that my mat is yours whenever you are thus lonely and sorrowful. But be not offended if you find that there are others lonely and sorrowful besides yourself, for as a human being I too am free to choose my company, and I hold you in no way bound. And so, in spite of all, I will give you a crocodile's tail with my own hand. So strange is the mind of man, and so little does he know his own heart, that my soul at this moment was as free and light as a bird, and I recalled nothing of the evil which had come to pass during those days. I was content and tasted no more crocodiles' tails that day. Next morning I came to fetch Merit to watch Pharaoh's festival procession. Despite her tavern upbringing, she looked very lovely in the summer dress that was made in the new fashion, and I was not at all ashamed to stand beside her in places reserved for the favored of Pharaoh. The avenue of rams was brilliant with banners and lined with the vast crowds who had come to see Pharaoh. Boys had climbed the trees in the gardens on either side, and Pepitaton had ordered countless baskets of flowers to be set out along the road so that, according to custom, the spectators could strew them in Pharaoh's path. My mood was hopeful, for I seemed to glimpse freedom and light for the land of Egypt. I had received a golden bowl from Pharaoh's house and had been nominated skull surgeon to his household. Beside me stood a mature and lovely woman who was my friend, and around us in the reserved places we saw only happy, smiling people. Yet profound silence reigned. The squawking of crows could be heard from the temple roof, for crows and vultures had taken up their abode in Thebes and were so gorged that they could not rise and fly back to their hills. It was a mistake for Pharaoh to allow painted Negroes to walk behind his chair. The mere sight of them aroused the fury of the people. There were few who had not suffered some injury during the preceding days. Many had lost their homes by fire, the tears of wives had not yet dried, men's wounds still smarted beneath the bandages, and their bruised and broken mouths could not smile. But Pharaoh Akhenaten appeared, swaying high in his chair above the heads of the people and visible to them all. Upon his head he wore the double crown of the two kingdoms, lily and papyrus. His arms were crossed on his breast, and his hands were hard clenched about the crook and whip of royalty. He sat motionless as an image, as the pharaohs of all ages have sat in the sight of the people, and there was a dread silence as he came, as if the sight of him had struck men dumb. The soldiers guarding the route raised their spears with a shout of greeting, and the more eminent of the onlookers also began to shout and throw flowers in front of the royal chair. But against the menacing hush of the crowd, their cry sounded thin and pitiful, like the buzz of a solitary midge on a winter's night, so that they soon fell silent and looked at one another in amazement. Now, against all tradition, Pharaoh moved. He raised the crook and whip in ecstatic greeting. The crowd surged back, and suddenly from its manifold throat broke a cry as terrible as the thunder of bursting seas among the rocks. Ammon! Ammon! Give us back Ammon, the king of all gods! As the mob bellowed and swayed and the cry rolled out ever louder, the crows and vultures winged upward from the temple roof and flapped their black pinions above the chair of Pharaoh. And the people cried, "Away with you, false Pharaoh! Begone!" The shout alarmed the bearers so that the chair halted in its course. When they again moved forward, goaded by the nervous officers of the guard, the people poured in an irresistible flood across the avenue of rounds, swept away the chain of soldiers, and threw themselves pell-mell before the chair to block its advance. It was no longer possible to follow exactly what was happening. The soldiers began to bellabore the people with their cudgels to clear the way, but soon they had recourse to spears and daggers in their own defense. Sticks and stones sang through the air, blood flowed across the street, and above the roar rose the screams of the dying. But not one stone was cast at Pharaoh, for he was born of the sun like all other pharaohs before him. His person was sacred, and no one in the crowd would have dared even in his dreams to lift a hand against him, though in their hearts all hated him. I do not believe that even the priests would have done so unheard of a thing. Pharaoh looked on unmolested. Then he arose, forgetting his dignity, and called out to halt the soldiers, but no one heard his cry in all the din. The mob stoned the guards, and the guards defended themselves and slew many of the people, who cried out unceasingly, "Ammon! Ammon! Give us back Ammon, and also, away with you, false Pharaoh! Begone! Thebes will have none of you!" Stones were cast on those of high rank, and the people surged threateningly about the reserved enclosures, so that women threw away their flowers, dropped their phials of perfume, and fled. At Horam's command the horns were sounded. From courts and side streets came the chariots that he had disposed there out of sight lest the people be provoked. Many were crushed beneath the hoofs and wheels, but Horam had ordered the removal of the sides from the sides of the chariots to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. They drove slowly and in a prearranged order, encircling Pharaoh's chair and also protecting the royal family and others in the procession, and so escorting them away. But the crowds would not disperse until the royal barges were seen rowing back across the river. Then they broke out in jubilation, and their rejoicing was yet more terrible than their anger. The ruffians among the crowd besieged the houses of the rich until the soldiers restored order and the people dispersed to their homes. Evening drew on and the crows circled down to tear at the bodies that remained lying in the avenue of rounds. Thus Pharaoh Akhenaton was confronted for the first time by his raging people and saw blood flowing on his god's account. He never forgot this sight. Hatred dropped poison into his love, and his fanaticism grew until at last he decreed that everyone who spoke the name of Ammon aloud or held his name concealed on images or vessels should be sent to the mines. I speak of these events before coming to the time in which they took place, to make plain their cause. That same evening I was summoned hastily to the Golden House, for Pharaoh had had an attack of his sickness. His physicians feared for his life and sought to share the burden of responsibility, for he had spoken of me. He lay long like one dead, his limbs grew cold, and his pulse was no longer to be detected. After a period of delirium during which he bit his tongue and lips until the blood flowed, he came to himself. He then dismissed all the other physicians, for he could not endure the sight of them. "Summon the boatman," he said to me, "and hoist red sails on my ship. Let my friends come with me, for I am going upon a journey and will let my vision lead me until I find a land belonging neither to gods nor to men. This land I will dedicate to Aten and build there a city that shall be the city of Aten. I will never again return to Thebes." He said also, "The conduct of the bands is more hateful to me than all that has gone before, more loathsome, more contemptible than anything my forebears ever saw, even among foreigners. Therefore I spurn Thebes and leave it to its own darkness." So intense was his agitation that he demanded to be carried to his ship while yet ailing, nor could I as his physician prevent him. Horam said, "It is better so." The people of Thebes will have their way, and Akhenaten will have his. Both will be satisfied, and there will be peace in the land once more. I attended Pharaoh on his voyage down the river. He was too impatient to wait even for the royal family, but set sail first. Horam ordered an escort of warships to accompany the vessel that he might come to no harm. So beneath her red sails Pharaoh's ship glided down the river, and Thebes fell behind. Walls, temple roofs, and the gilded tips of the obelisk sank below the horizon, and lastly the three peaks, the eternal guardians of Thebes, vanished also. But the memory of Thebes remained with us for many days, for the river was full of fat crocodiles whose tails splashed up the foul waters, and 100 times 100 swollen corpses drifted with the current. There was no shoal or clump of reeds without its body, held fast by clothes or hair, and all because of Pharaoh Akhenaten's god. But he knew nothing of this, for he lay in his cabin on soft mats, where servants anointed him with perfumed oils and burned incense about him, that he might not smell the smell of his god. When we had been sailing for 10 days, the river was pure again, and Pharaoh stepped into the bows to look about him. The earth was summer yellow, farmers were gathering in their harvest, and in the evenings the cattle were driven down to the water's edge to drink, and herdsmen blew on their double pipes. When the people saw Pharaoh's ship, they arrayed themselves in white and ran down to the shore, where they shouted their greetings and waved their branches of palm. The sight of these contented people was better than any medicine to Pharaoh. Now and then he would give orders for the ship to put into the bank, and he would go ashore to talk to the people, to touch them, and to bless the women and children with his hands. The sheep also came shyly up, to nuzzle and nibble at the hem of his robe, and he laughed for joy. In the darkness of night he stood in the bows gazing at the burning stars, and he said to me, I will divide all the land of the false god among those who are content with little and have labored with their hands, that they may be happy and bless the name of Aten. I will divide all the land among them, for my heart rejoices at the sight of plump children and laughing women and men who labor in the name of Aten without fear or hatred of any. He said also, the heart of man is dark. I should not have believed this had I not seen it for myself. For so lucent is my own clarity that I do not comprehend the darkness, and when light pours into my heart, I forget all the hearts that are twisted and shadowy. There must be many who do not comprehend Aten, though they see him and feel his love, for they have lived their lives in darkness, and their eyes do not know the light when they see it. They call it evil and say that it hurts their eyes. Therefore I leave them alone, and do not trouble them, but I will not dwell among them. I gather about me those who are dearest to me, and will remain among them, never to leave them, that I may not suffer those evil pains in my head through seeing things that oppress my spirit and are hideous in the sight of Aten. Screwing up his eyes at the stars, he went on, Night is abomination to me. I do not love the darkness, I fear it. I do not love the stars, for when they shine, jackals slink from their dens, lions leave their lairs and roar with bloodlust. Thebes is night to me, and so I spurn it. In truth I spurn all that is old and crooked, and put my faith in the young and in children. The spring of the world is born of them. Those who from childhood dedicate themselves to the teaching of Aten are purified, and so the whole world shall be purified. Schools shall be transformed, the old teachers driven forth, and new texts written for children to copy. Moreover, I will make writing simpler than it now is, for we need no pictures to understand it. I shall cause a script to be adopted that even the humblest may quickly learn. There shall no longer be a gulf between scribes and people. The people shall learn to write so that in every village, even the smallest, there shall be one to read what I shall write to them. For I shall write to them often, of many things that they should know. Pharaoh's talk disturbed me. I knew this new script that was easy to learn and to read. It was not sacred writing, nor was it as beautiful or as rich in content as the old, and every self-respecting scribe despised it. Therefore I said, popular script is ugly and barbarous, and it is not sacred writing. What will become of Egypt if everyone is made literate? Such a thing has never been. No one will then be content to labor with his hands. The soil will lie untilled, and people will take no pleasure in their ability to write when they are starving. I should not have said this, for he cried out in high indignation, so near to me then is the darkness. It stands beside me in you, sinew. You cast doubts and obstacles in my path, but truth burns like fire within me. My eyes pierce all barriers as if they were barriers of pure water, and I behold the world that will come after me. In that world is neither hatred nor fear. Men share their toil with one another, and there are neither rich nor poor among them. All are equal, all can read what I write to them. No man says to another, dirty Syrian, or miserable Negro. All are brothers, and war is banished from the world. And seeing this, I feel my strength increase. So great is my joy that my heart is near to bursting. Once more I was persuaded of his madness. I led him to his sleeping mat and gave him soothing medicine. Yet his words were a torment, and my heart felt the sting of them, for there was something in me that had matured to receive his message. I said to my heart, his mind is greatly disordered because of his sickness, nevertheless the disorder is both beneficent and infectious. I could wish that his visions might come true, although my reason tells me that such a world could exist nowhere but in the Western land. Still my heart cries out that his truth is higher than all other truths that have been spoken, and that no greater truth will ever be spoken after him, notwithstanding that bloodshed and ruin break from his footprints. If he lives long enough, he will overthrow his own great kingdom. And as I gazed at the stars through the darkness I reflected, I sinew am a stranger in the world and do not even know who brought me into it. Of my own will I became the poor man's physician in Thebes, and gold means little to me, though I prefer a fat goose to dry bread and wine to water. None of that is so important that I could not abstain from it. Having no more than my life to lose, why should I not be a prop for his weakness, stand at his side and encourage him, without misgivings? For he is Pharaoh. The power is his, and there is no more wealthy or more fertile land in the whole world than Egypt, and who knows but Egypt may survive the trial. If such a thing could be, then indeed the world would be renewed, men would be brothers, and there would be neither rich nor poor. Never before has a man been offered such an opportunity to bring his truth into being, for this man is born Pharaoh, and the chance will never come again. Here is the one moment in all ages of the world when his truth may be made reality. Such were my waking dreams aboard the rocking ship, while the night wind bore to my nostrils the fragrance of ripe grain and of the threshing floors. But the wind chilled me and the dream melted, and I said to myself ruefully, if only Captor were here to hear his words. For although a physician is a clever man and can heal many maladies, yet the world's sickness and misery is so great that not all the doctors in the world could cure it even if they were competent, and there are ills before which physicians are powerless. Thus Akhenaten may be a physician for the human heart, but he cannot be everywhere. There are hearts so hardened and blackened that not even his truth can avail them anything. Captor would say, even were the time to come when there would be neither poor nor rich, yet there will always be wise and stupid, sly and simple, for so there have ever been and ever will be. The strong man sets his foot on the neck of the weakling, the cunning man runs off with the simpleton's purse and sets the dunce to work for him. Man is a crooked dealer, and even his virtue is imperfect. Only he who lies down never to rise again is wholly good. Already you may see the fruits of that goodness, and those who have most reason to bless it are the crocodiles of the river and the gorged crows on the temple roof. Pharaoh Akhenaten spoke with me, and I spoke with my weak and vacillating heart. On the 15th day we reached land that belonged neither to a god nor to any eminent man. From the shore its hills shaded from golden yellow into blue. The soil lay uncultivated, and only a few herdsmen guarded their flocks there and lived in reed huts along the bank. Here Pharaoh went ashore and dedicated the land to Aten in order to found on it a new city. This future city he named Akhetaten, the city of the heavens. Ship after ship followed, and he gathered together his master builders and architects and showed them where the main streets were to run, where his golden palace and the temple of Aten were to stand. As his followers joined him, he pointed out to each the site of his house. The builders drove away the herdsmen and their sheep, tore down their reed huts, and built quays along the shore. For these builders Pharaoh allotted space for their own town outside the city where, before starting the work commanded of them, they were allowed to build mud houses for themselves. 5 streets ran north and south, 5 east and west. The houses that lined them were all of identical height and each contained 2 similar rooms. The roasting pit was in the same place in every house, as was every mat and pitcher. Pharaoh bore goodwill to all his workmen and wished them to share the same benefits, that they might dwell happily in their own place outside Pharaoh's city and bless the name of Aten. Then came winter and the season of flood. Pharaoh did not return to Thebes as was his custom, but remained aboard his ship, which was now the seat of government. As stone was laid upon stone and column after column was erected, he rejoiced greatly. Often he would break into malicious laughter when he beheld the beautiful, delicate timber houses rising along the streets, for the thought of Thebes corroded his mind like poison. On this city of Akhetaten he spent all the money he had won from Ammon, and he divided Ammon's land among the very poor. I had much work to do, for although Pharaoh himself improved in health and spirits as he beheld his city blossom from the soil on its colored pillars, yet sickness raged among the workmen before the ground had been drained. Also there were many building accidents because of the haste imposed upon the men. As soon as the river had fallen, Horam landed at Akhetaten in company with members of the court, though he did not intend to stay longer than was needful to persuade Pharaoh to change his mind about disbanding the army. Pharaoh had commanded him to release the Nubians and Shardanas from his service and send them home, but Horam had delayed fulfillment of the order on all manner of pretexts, having reason to fear that revolt would soon break out in Syria and being minded to lead the troops into that country. But Pharaoh Akhenaten was unshakable in his resolve, and Horam but wasted his time in Akhetaten. Every day their conversations were the same. Horam said, "There is serious unrest in Syria, and the Egyptian colonies there are feeble. King Aziru is fomenting hatred toward Egypt. I have no doubt that when the time is ripe he will start open revolt." Pharaoh Akhenaten said, "Have you seen the floors in my palace on which artists are just now creating reed swamps and swimming ducks in the Cretan manner? As to a revolt in Syria, I think it unlikely, for I have sent to all its princes the cross of life. King Aziru in particular is my friend, having received the cross of life from me and raised a temple to Aten in the land of Amuru. No doubt you have already seen the colonnaded hall of Aten beside my palace here. It is worth seeing, although the pillars are of brick only, to save time. Moreover, the thought of slaves toiling in the quarries is repugnant to me. But to return to Aziru, you have no grounds to doubt his loyalty. I have received from him countless clay tablets in which he seeks eagerly to learn new things of Aten. If you wish, my scribes can show you these tablets as soon as our archives are in order." Horam answered, "I spit on his clay tablets. They are as foul and as false as himself. But if it is your firm resolve to disband the army, let me at least reinforce the frontier troops, for already the tribes of the south are driving their herds within our boundary stones, to the grazing grounds in the land of Cush and in Syria. They are burning the villages of our black allies, which is no hard task since they are built of straw." Akhenaten said, "I believe it is not ill will that drives them but poverty. Our allies must share their grazing with the southern tribes, and I will also send them the cross of life. Nor do I believe they fire the villages through set purpose. As you say, these are easily kindled, and one should not condemn whole tribes for the sake of a few villages. But if you will, then by all means strengthen the frontier guards in the land of Cush and in Syria, since you are answerable for the safety of the realm, but see to it that they are guards only and not a standing army." Horam said, "Akhenaten, my mad friend, you must let me reform the garrison troops all over the country, for the disbanded men are robbing right and left in their poverty and stealing the tribute hides of the peasants, whom they beat with sticks." Pharaoh Akhenaten said, as one pointing a moral, "See what came of your refusal to listen to me. Had you spoken more of Aten to these men, they would not now be acting thus, but their hearts are darkened, the scars of your whiplash burn their backs, and they know not what they do. And by the by, have you noticed that both my daughters can now walk? Meritaten takes care of the younger one, and they have an enchanting little gazelle for a playfellow. Well, there is nothing to prevent your hiring the disbanded men as guards up and down the country, provided they remain guards and are not embodied into a standing army for war. And to my mind it would be well to break up all the chariots, for suspicion breeds suspicion, and we have to convince our neighbors that whatever happens Egypt will never have recourse to war. Would it not be simpler to sell the chariots to Aziru or the Hittites? They pay well for chariots and horses, sneered Horam. I can see that it would not pay you to keep a regular army when you bury all the wealth of Egypt in a swamp or make bricks of it. They disputed thus day after day until by sheer tenacity Horam gained the position of commander-in-chief of the frontier troops and of all the garrisons. It was Pharaoh who decided how they should be armed, namely with wooden spears. Their numbers were left for Horam to determine. Horam then summoned all district commanders to Memphis because it lay in the middle of the country and on the borders of the two kingdoms. He was on the point of embarking for that city when a river courier arrived, with a stack of letters and clay tablets from Syria, full of alarming news. His hopes were rekindled. These communications showed beyond dispute that King Aziru, having learned of the disturbances in Thebes, considered the moment favorable for the annexation of certain cities beyond his borders. Megiddo, the key to Syria, was also in revolt, and Aziru's forces were besieging the fortress to which the Egyptian garrison had retired and from which they were now appealing to Pharaoh for speedy help. But Pharaoh Akhenaten said, "I fancy King Aziru has good reason for his actions. He is a fiery man, and it may be that my envoys have offended him. I will not judge him until he has opportunity to defend himself. But one thing I can do, and it was wrong of me not to think of it before. Now that a city of Aten is rising in the Black Land, I must build another in the Red Land, in Syria, and in Cush. Megiddo is a junction for the caravan routes and therefore the most suitable place, but I suspect that just now it is too disturbed to permit building. But you have spoken to me of Jerusalem, where you built a temple to Aten during your campaign against the Kabiri, a campaign for which I can never forgive myself. It is not so central as Megiddo, being farther south. Nevertheless, I shall take immediate steps for the building of a city of Aten in Jerusalem so that in future that shall be the center of Syria, though now it is only a tumble-down village." When Horam heard this, he broke his whip, threw it at Pharaoh's feet, and went aboard his ship. And so he sailed to Memphis to reorganize the garrison troops throughout the country. Yet his stay in Akhetaten had had this advantage: I had been able to tell him quietly and at leisure all that I had seen and heard in Babylon, Mitanni, the land of Hatti, and in Crete. He listened in silence, nodding now and again as if what I told him were not altogether news, and he fingered the knife I had been given by the harbor master. All that I recounted to him of roads, bridges, and rivers he caused to be set down in writing, also any names I mentioned. Finally I told him to consult Captor in the matter, for Captor was as childish as himself in his memory for all manner of useless things. He departed from Akhetaten in anger, and Pharaoh rejoiced to see him go. The conversations with Horam had greatly plagued him so that even the sight of the man gave him a headache. To me he said musingly, "It may be the wool of Aten that we lose Syria, and if so, who am I to oppose it, since it must be for the good of Egypt? For the wealth of Syria has eaten at Egypt's heart. All superfluity, all softness, vices, and evil practices have come from there. Were we to lose Syria, Egypt would return to simpler ways, to ways of truth, and that is the best thing that can befall it. The new life must start here and spread among all nations." My heart rose up against his talk, and I said, "The commander of the Smyrna garrison has a son named Rameses, a lively boy with big brown eyes who loves to play with pretty stones. I treated him once for chicken pox. And in Megiddo there dwells an Egyptian woman who, having heard of my skill, once visited me in Smyrna. Her belly was swollen, I opened it with my knife and she lived. Her skin was soft as wool, and she walked beautifully like all Egyptian women, even though her belly was swollen and her eyes were bright with fever. I do not understand why you tell me of these things, said Akhenaten, and he began to make a sketch of a temple he beheld in his mind's eye. He constantly vexed his architects and master builders with drawings and explanations, though they understood their business better than he. I mean that I can see that little Ramses with his mouth cut and bruised and the locks at his temple clotted with blood. I see the woman from Megiddo lying naked and bleeding in the courtyard of the fortress while men from Amurru violate her. Yet I acknowledge that my thoughts are trivial compared with yours, and that a ruler cannot remember every Ramses and every soft-skinned woman among his subjects. Pharaoh clenched his fists, and his eyes darkened as he cried, Sinew, can you not understand that if I must choose death rather than life, then I will choose the death of 100 Egyptians rather than that of 1,000 Syrians. Were I to give battle in Syria so as to liberate every Egyptian there, then many, both Syrians and Egyptians, would lose their lives in the war. Were I to meet evil with evil, only evil could result. But if I meet evil with good, the resulting evil is less. I will not choose death rather than life, and so I stop my ears to your talk. Speak to me no more of Syria if you love me and if my life is dear to you. When I think of that, my heart feels all the suffering those who die for my will's sake must undergo, and a man cannot long endure the sufferings of many. Give me peace for the sake of Aten and of my truth. He bowed his head, and his eyes were swollen and bloodshot in his grief, and his thick lips trembled. I left him in peace, but in my own ears I heard the thunder of battering rams against the Megiddo walls and the cries of outraged women in the woolen tents of the Amorites. I hardened my heart against these sounds, for I loved him, for all his madness, and perhaps I loved him the more because of it, for his madness was more beautiful than the wisdom of other men. 5. The founding of the new city brought division into the royal family. For the queen mother refused to follow her son into the desert. Thebes was her city, and the golden house of Pharaoh, glowing hazy blue and russet among its walls and gardens by the river, had been built by Pharaoh Amenhotep for his beloved. Tyre, the queen mother, had begun life as a poor fowler girl in the reed swamps of the lower kingdom. She would not leave Thebes, and Princess Bakitamen stayed with her. Ei the priest, bearer of the crook on the right hand of the king, ruled and sat in judgment there on the king's throne with the leather scrolls before him. Life in Thebes went on as before, only the false pharaoh was absent, and unregretted. Queen Nefertiti returned to Thebes for the birth of her next child, for she dared not be brought to bed without the help of the physicians and the Negro sorcerers of Thebes. Here she bore her third daughter, whose name was Akhenaten, and who would in time be queen. To ease the birth, the sorcerers narrowed and lengthened the child's head as they had done with the other princesses. When the girl grew up, all the court ladies, and others who wished to be in the fashion and to imitate the styles of the court, took to wearing false backs to their heads. But the princesses themselves kept their heads close shaven to show off the fine shape of their skulls. Artists also admired it, and they carved and drew and painted numerous portraits of them without suspecting that this distinctive feature was but a result of the magician's arts. When Nefertiti had borne her child, she returned to Akhenaten and took up her residence in the palace, which in the meantime had been set in habitable order. She left the other women behind in Thebes, being vexed at having given birth to 3 daughters and unwilling to let Pharaoh waste his virility on the couches of others. Akhenaten was content to have it so, for he was weary of fulfilling his duty in the women's house and wanted no one but Nefertiti, as all who beheld her beauty could well understand. Not even her third confinement had dimmed her loveliness. She seemed younger and more radiant than before, but whether this change in her was due to the city of Akhenaten or to the black men's witchcraft I cannot say. Thus Akhenaten rose from the wilderness in a single year. Palm trees waved proudly along its splendid streets, pomegranates ripened and reddened in the gardens, and in the fish pools floated the rosy flowers of the lotus. The whole city was a blossoming garden, for the houses were of wood, airy and fragile as pavilions, and their columns of palm and reed were light and brightly colored. The gardens entered the very houses, for the paintings on the walls were of palms and sycamores swayed by the breezes of eternal spring. On the floors were beds of reeds and multicolored swimming fish, and ducks with brilliant wings rose in flight. In this city nothing was lacking to rejoice the heart of man. Tame gazelles wandered in the gardens, while in the streets the lightest of carriages were drawn by fiery horses adorned with ostrich plumes. The kitchens were fragrant with keen spices brought from every part of the world. Thus the city of the heavens was completed, and when autumn returned and swallows emerged from the mud to dart in restless flocks above the rising waters, Pharaoh Akhenaten consecrated the city and the land to Aten. He consecrated the boundary stones north, south, east, and west, and on each of these stones was the representation of Aten shedding the benediction of his rays on Pharaoh and the house of Pharaoh. Inscriptions on the stones recorded Pharaoh's vows never again to set foot beyond these boundaries. For this ceremony the workmen laid stone-paved roads to the four quarters of the land so that Pharaoh might drive to the borders in his golden carriage attended by his family in their carriages and chairs and by the members of his court, who strewed flowers as they went, while flutes and stringed instruments sounded in praise of Aten. Not even in death did Pharaoh intend to leave the city of Aten. When the building of it was finished, he sent his workmen to the eastern hills within the consecrated land, to hew out eternal resting places. They found work enough to last their whole lives through and were never able to return to their birthplace. They did not greatly desire to do so but accustomed themselves to dwelling in their own town and in Pharaoh's shadow, for grain was measured to them abundantly, their oil jars were never empty, and their wives bore them healthy children. When Pharaoh had decided to build tombs for himself and his nobles and to present one to each of his distinguished followers who would live in the city of the heavens with him and who believed in Aten, he built also a house of death outside the city so that the bodies of those who died in Akhenaten should be preserved forever. To this end he summoned from Thebes those embalmers and washers who held the foremost place in their craft. They came down the river in a black ship, and their smell was borne before them on the wind so that the people hid in their houses with bowed heads, reciting prayers to Aten. Many also prayed to the old gods and made the holy sign of Ammon, for when they smelled the body washers' smell Aten seemed far away and their thoughts turned to their earlier deities. The embalmers stepped ashore from the vessel with all their materials, blinking with eyes that were accustomed to the dark and swearing bitterly at the light, which hurt them. They entered swiftly into the new house of death, taking their smell with them so that the place became a home for them, which they never left again. Among them was old Ramos, the expert of the pincers, whose task was to extract the brain. I met him in the house of death, for the priests of Aten held the house of death in horror, and Pharaoh had placed it under my charge. When he had gazed at me for some time he knew me again, and marveled. I made myself known to him to gain his confidence, for uncertainty gnawed like a worm at my heart and I desired to know how my revenge had prospered at the house of death in Thebes. When we had spoken a little of his work, I asked, Ramos my friend, did you ever have under your hands a beautiful woman who was brought to the house of death during the terror, and whose name I believe was Nefer-Nefer-Nefer? He regarded me, bent-backed and blinking like a tortoise, and said, in truth, Sinew, you are the first distinguished man who has ever called a corpse washer his friend. My heart is greatly moved, and the information you require is doubtless of great import since you so address me. Surely it was not you who brought her one dark night, swathed in the black robe of death. For if you were that man you are the friend of no corpse washer, and if they come to hear of it, they will stab you with poisoned knives and so inflict upon you a most hideous death. His words caused me to tremble, and I said, whoever may have brought her, she deserved her fate. Yet from your words I suspect that she was not dead but came to life under the hands of the washers. Ramos answered, most certainly that frightful woman was restored to life, though how you know of this I prefer not to guess. She awoke, for such women never die, and if they die, they should be burned so that they can never return. When we came to know her, we gave her the name of Setnefer, the Devil's Beauty. A dreadful suspicion seized me, and I asked, "Why do you speak of her as of something that has been? Is she not still in the house of death?" The washers vowed that they would keep her there for 70 times 70 days. Ramos rattled his knives and pincers angrily, and I believe he would have struck me if I had not brought him a jar of the best wine in Pharaoh's cellar. He merely felt its dusty seal with his thumb and said, "We bore you no ill will, Sinew. You were to me as my own son, and I would have kept you all your life in the house of death and taught you my art. We embalmed the bodies of your parents as only those of the eminent are embalmed, and did not spare the finest oils and balsams. Why then did you wish us so ill as to bring that terrible woman to us alive? Know that before her coming we led a simple, hard-working life, rejoicing our hearts with beer and greatly enriching ourselves by thefts of jewelry from the dead, without regard to sex or standing, and also by selling to sorcerers such organs as they require for their spells. But after the coming of that woman, the house of death became like some abyss of the underworld. The men knifed one another and fought together like mad dogs. She stole all our wealth from us, all the gold and silver we had amassed in the course of years and hidden in the house of death, nor did she scorn copper. Even our clothes she took from us, for having robbed the young men of all they possessed she set them on to steal from the old ones such as I, whose lust could no longer be kindled. No more than 30 times 30 days had passed before she had stripped us naked of possessions. Then she left, taking all her wealth with her, and we could not prevent her, for if one placed himself in her path he was opposed by another, for the sake of a smile or a touch of her fingers. Thus she took from us our property and our peace. She had by then no less than 300 deben of gold, to say nothing of silver, copper, linen bands, and salves that for years we had stolen from the dead, as the custom is. She vowed to return to us in a year to see how much we had been able to save by then. There is more theft in the house of life than there has ever been before. Moreover, the washers have learned to pilfer from each other, and not only from the bodies, so that our peace has altogether departed. By this you may understand why we gave her the name of Setnefer, for she is exceedingly fair though her beauty is of Set. It was now I learned how childish my revenge had been, since Nefer returned unharmed from the house of death richer than before, and, as I believe, suffered no ill effects from her stay save the smell, which soaked into her body and for some time prevented her from plying her trade. My revenge had eaten at my own heart and left her unharmed. When I knew this, I knew also that revenge brings no satisfaction. Its sweetness is brief, and it turns against the avenger, to eat at his heart like fire.